Now let's welcome the opening panel, moderated by the Director of DARPA's Information Innovation Office, Dr. Brian Pierce.
Well, good morning and welcome to the panel on achieving a beneficent cyber future. I'm really excited to have Dan Kaufman and John Launchberry on the panel, who as former directors of the Information Innovation Office, or I2O, played key roles in shaping and expanding DARPA's cyber portfolio. After leaving DARPA in 2015, Dan is now the head of advanced technology and products at Google. John Launchberry is now the chief scientist for Galois after leaving DARPA in 2017. John is also the founder of Galois. John Everett and I complete the panel as the current deputy director and director of I2O. I will kick off the panel with an introduction to what DARPA is doing to help guarantee the achievement of a beneficent cyber future, which will be followed by the perspectives of Dan, John Launchberry, and John Everett. After sharing their insights, the panel members will then take questions, and I want to remind you to please use your D60 app to submit those questions. I know that all four of us really recognize that we stand on the shoulders of those before us. The first director of an information technology office at DARPA was J.C.R. Lickliter, who said in 1960, in not too many years, there we are, in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought. Cyber realizes on a global scale Lickliter's vision of a human-machine partnership or symbiosis. Cyber can be seen as a collective human-machine symbiosis involving many people and machines. This symbiosis is expressed in wearable devices, smartphones, cars, homes, offices, and in military networks and systems important to the Department of Defense. All these devices, systems, and networks come together in the internet, making it foundational to cyber. The internet, really starting with the first 4 nodes created by DARPA in 1969, as shown here, to the billions of users today, has boosted our productivity and economy to incredible heights. But it has also opened avenues for bad behavior by a spectrum of threats ranging from individuals to nation states. It really should be no surprise that cyber is a leading concern for national security. And DARPA is rising to the challenge of preventing the abuse of cyber by the relatively few threats to national security while nurturing the beneficence of cyber for the many. DARPA seeks to help counter the bad while fostering the good in cyber through the development of technologies that help guarantee A, the trust of the human in the machine, and B, the deterrence of cyber bad actors. Expanding upon the guarantee of trust, this includes trust in the data, as well as trust in the software, firmware, and hardware that process, store, and transmit the data. Expanding upon the second guarantee of deterrence, this means convincing bad actors that any malicious cyber actions will not yield significant benefits given their likely costs. Achievement of guarantees in trust and deterrence are, we believe, areas where technology can help provide solutions that enable sound policy. I will now describe several of DARPA's solutions and their policy implications, starting with the important guarantee of trust. Humans, or people, have long tended to place trust in images and videos, because after all, seeing is believing. Consumer imaging products, such as smartphones, have certainly become ubiquitous, and it is estimated that about 2 billion images and videos are uploaded daily to social media. Now, at the same time, a growing proportion of this media has been manipulated, as presented here in the chart, where on the left you see a manipulated image, and on the right we see how the detection of pixel-level inconsistencies can be used to indicate the manipulations. Now, most manipulations are benign, done for fun or for artistic value, but some are for adversarial purposes, such as propaganda or disinformation campaigns. The tools used today to detect manipulations lack robustness and scalability and address only a few aspects of media authentication. An end-to-end platform that provides a complete and automated forensic analysis does not exist. Well, DARPA is trying to really help level this playing field, which currently favors the image manipulator, through the development of technologies for the automated assessment of the integrity of images and videos, which includes the use of machine learning AI. Now, while many exciting new applications of AI continue to be developed, a new challenge has emerged, that of trust. Since we do not understand the inner workings of machine learning algorithms, how can we understand them? To help build trust in AI, DARPA is developing a new generation of machine learning techniques that are able to provide a rationale that explains conclusions reached by the system, such as shown here in the chart, where in addition to classifying the image as that of a cat, it provides an explanation as to why it came to this conclusion. If current trends continue, future autonomous systems will need to perform increasingly complex and sensitive missions, and machine learning AI will be a critical part of these systems. However, if developers, users, and senior leaders are to feel confident enough to deploy and use AI-aided systems, then these systems must be able to explain their rationale, and the recommendations, decisions, and actions must be delivered in a manner that human users understand and trust. Today, most machine learning systems provide no explanations, or the explanations they do provide are too detailed and at the wrong level of abstraction. DARPA is developing the tools to help build explainable AI systems. So I've spoken about trust in images and videos and trust in AI. I now would like to say a little about trust in autonomy. Essential to the development of autonomous motor vehicles is the collection of data generated by driving many miles. For example, one commercial fleet of self-driving vehicles has collectively driven over 4 million miles on US public roads during the period of 2009 to 2017. This is an impressive achievement, but it is still only about 0.1% of the 320 trillion miles driven by all US cars during that time period. Developers work to close this gap by constructing models using data from the physical miles driven, and then employing these models in simulations involving thousands of virtual vehicles driving billions of virtual miles. The combination of physical and virtual miles driven enables developers to reduce risk to the point where the rest can be mitigated by purchasing insurance. Well, the DoD, or Department of Defense, has many missions requiring very strong assurance for safe and correct operation, and for which they have to bear the full burden of reducing risk to an acceptable level. DARPA is developing technologies for the continual assurance of autonomous systems, where continual assurance is defined as an assurance of the safety and functional correctness of the system, provided provisionally in design, and then continually monitored, updated, and evaluated during operation as the system and its environment evolve. Well, DARPA is doing much more to help guarantee the trust of the human in the machine, such as trust in the privacy of data. But now I'd like to turn to what we're doing to help guarantee cyber deterrence. Cyber deterrence revolves around three key concerns. The first concern relates to the proverb, "Those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones." In other words, our dependence on a vulnerable cyber infrastructure could constrain our cyber deterrence actions. A second concern is that cyber attackers have so far been able to maintain a high degree of anonymity, which makes it difficult to identify and deter them. The third concern is if we undertake a credible in-kind response to a cyber attack, we want our response to be accurate and calibrated. To address these concerns, we organize our cyber deterrence technologies into three areas with objectives to, one, strengthen the cyber resilience of our networks and systems, which includes cyber physical ones such as the electric power grid. Two, achieve broad cyber situational awareness, which includes attribution of attackers. And three, create accurate and calibrated cyber response capabilities. I will now describe each of these areas, starting with resilience. Metaphorically, we have built for ourselves a cyberglass house at which adversaries may freely cast stones. We want our house to be resilient against these attacks, and we recognize that construction plays a very key role in this resilience. Just as we see here on the left side of the chart, where we have a friend working contentedly while the stones bounce off the house harmlessly. Now, software is central to the construction of this cyberglass house. And toward this end, we use formal methods to ensure that software is built as specified, that it is correct by construction. Software that does what it's specified to do and nothing else works and helps tremendously in hardening it against cyber attack. We are developing tools and technologies to facilitate code construction using formal methods for embedded software, such as that in the mission computer for a helicopter. In this particular case, we hardened the operating system software, and that for the control and command modules, leaving unprotected the software for a camera module. We gave this unprotected software to a red team, challenging them to break out of it into the rest of the system. Now, we had formally proven that an attacker could not break out of this unprotected software, and indeed, the red team could not do so, really thereby upholding the power of mathematics. Well, despite our best efforts to repel cyber attackers by hardening the software, they do get in, and we use automation to engage them in machine time rather than human time. One DARPA program that epitomizes this approach is the Cyber Grand Challenge, with the objective of automating what human hacker teams do in DEF CON's Capture the Flag competition, which is the world's premier tournament for computer hackers. The automation developed under the challenge includes the discovery and patching of software vulnerabilities. Each of the 7 final teams in the challenge, as represented here in this chart by the 7 high-performance computing systems, developed software-based cyber reasoning systems that went head-to-head in the world's first machine versus machine cyber competition, held at the beginning of DEF CON in 2016 in Las Vegas. It was a great success, with $3.75 million in prizes awarded, $2 million for first place, $1 million for second, and $750,000 for third. A major highlight of the event was that software flaws can last minutes instead of as long as years. For example, one of the cyber reasoning systems discovered a software vulnerability actually unknown to humans in one of the rounds of the competition, and then 3 rounds later, a second system uploaded a patch to this vulnerability in a elapsed time of 15 minutes. I can't emphasize enough how much this automation is a game changer in strengthening cyber resilience. Well, we do need to know, though, who is throwing stones at our cyberglass house, or in other words, we need deeper insight into and greater situational awareness of adversarial activities. DARPA is applying technologies such as data analytics and machine learning AI to enhance cyber situational awareness, which includes attribution of attackers. The anonymity of cyberspace represents a huge challenge to cyber situational awareness and cyber deterrence. And DARPA is making it possible to attribute malicious cyber actions to individual cyber adversary operators. Our approach involves the correlation and fusion of data from a variety of sources to detect and characterize data tracks between an attacker and its target. This information has many uses, with one being a convincing public attribution of a cyber attack, and a second being, of course, greatly enhanced cyber situational awareness. Well, once we know who has been throwing stones at our house, we certainly would like multiple options in terms of an accurate and calibrated response, just as we see our friend doing here actually quite well in the chart. To help reach this goal, we are developing technologies to expand our cyber response capabilities. Malicious actors, shown here in red, are currently able to compromise and use with impunity large numbers of third-party computers and other devices indicated here in gray. And as blue, we want to counter red's actions in gray. Such collections of conscripted devices, commonly referred to as botnets, are used for criminal espionage, and computer network attack purposes, and often a combination of all three. Recent examples of botnets and most similar malicious code include Mirai and WannaCry. The potential scale of their effects makes botnets a national security threat. Now, just improving the security posture of blue networks alone is not sufficient to deal with these threats, as the majority of botnet nodes reside in neutral networks or gray space, which is, as depicted here, the largest part of cyberspace. Current approaches to limiting or addressing botnets are limited in terms of technology options and in terms of policy, and specifically policy on how the Department of Defense and law enforcement agencies can respond to cyber attacks from conscripted computers in gray space. DARPA is developing technologies for the appropriate authorities to identify and neutralize botnets and other large-scale malware on conscripted devices in a manner that is scalable, timely, safe, and reliable, and in accordance with evolving legal and policy guidelines. Through our advances, DARPA is providing leadership, both technologically and in the development of sound cyber policies. In closing, cyber and modern society in general are increasingly a collective human-machine partnership or symbiosis involving many people and machines. To support and assure this partnership, DARPA is developing technologies to help provide guarantees in two critical areas, with the first guarantee being the trust of the human in the machine, and the second guarantee being the deterrence of cyber bad actors. We hope that our advances will indeed bring about a beneficent cyber future. So thank you, and now I'm going to hand it over to Dan for his perspective.
All right. Good job, man. All right. Well, good morning. I'm really pleased to be here. And my first thought when I got invited back was I was very excited because I got to come back to a place that for 10 years I called my home, and I wanted to hook up with old friends and reminisce about some programs we did. But mostly it was to come and celebrate DARPA, which I think is not only one of the great institutions in America, I think it's one of the great institutions in the world. And so I was very excited to come back. And then my second immediate thought was, I've known Steve Walker for over a decade, and he still thinks giving me an open mic in front of a crowd is a good idea. So that's a testable hypothesis, which we will explore in the next 10 minutes or so. On a more serious note, when Brian and John asked me to come and they said, hey, can you talk about cyber? Can you talk about AI? Some thoughts you have about future directions, future programs. I immediately got excited and started filling up notebooks, as people who worked with me know forever. I used to carry them and wrote up tons of ideas. And I very quickly realized I had far too many ideas than I could possibly relay in 10 minutes. And so I needed some kind of filter. How am I going to filter this down to the one or two that I have time to share with you? And I started to think back about programs we did, and I wondered if there was any commonalities, things that worked, things that seemed to be indicative of successful programs, and use that as a filter. And I came up with three. One which I'll share by way of anecdote, two just sort of observations, and then I'll tell you the two that sort of survived the filtering process. The first one is just an anecdote. It was my first week at DARPA in that old Darth Vader building right across from Starbucks, and I was in the elevator. I still remember this. I was in the elevator. I'd been here maybe, 2-3 days, and there was another gentleman in the elevator, and he said, "Are you a new DARPA PM?" And my first thought was, I wonder how he knows this. I guess I had that new PM smell or something. And I said, I am. And he said, well, welcome aboard and good luck. And I said, well, thanks. I appreciate that. I'll take all the luck I can get. And he turned on me and he said, why would you say that? Why do you think you need luck? And my first thought was, because you can be questioned by people in an elevator at DARPA, evidently. But I decided to be more honest, and I said, well, honestly, because of the legacy, like I find it's an intimidating place to work. You look at the history of what they've done. I just want to make sure that what I do is meaningful, that it adds somehow, even in a small part, how it adds to the legacy, how it does something. And he said, you know what, don't worry about that. Don't worry about the agency, don't worry about legacy, think about the warfighter. If you do something really meaningful for the warfighter, everything else will take care of itself. And I thought that was profoundly true, and I thanked him. I said, you seem to have a perspective, you must work here. And he said, no, I mean, I did a long time ago, I don't now. I said, well, maybe, if you don't mind, I can ping you from time to time and ask you questions. And he said, sure, and I said, my name is Dan, and he said his name was Larry, and that's how I got to meet Larry Lin. who I then asked questions of for 10 years and unfailingly got good answers. So the first sort of filter was, does this have a chance of having a meaningful impact to the warfighter? And so it got rid of a lot of interesting questions I had on my list that are interesting computer science questions, interesting academic questions, a few things that got my math geek on, because John and I share it, but I filtered it down. The next was an observation that surprised me, but when I look back at all the programs that were successful, I noticed one thing that they had in common, which was that they were to some degree controversial. And I want to be clear, it's not that they set out to be controversial. I don't think making something controversial makes it a good program. But I think if you're doing something that's disruptive or is challenging the status quo, it is natural that some people get upset about it. And I had a long list of people that got upset about things that we did. Congressmen, senators, defense contractors, admirals, services, service labs, the list went on. And I realized in hindsight that I was extremely blessed because I had very powerful DARPA directors who defended me and defended the programs from all of those attacks. And they stood up and always said the same things, much more diplomatically than I say things, but basically was, I understand this makes you uncomfortable, these things are important, and we're going to go ahead and do them. And I want people to understand the magnitude of the power of this. And when I say people were unhappy, I mean we had multi-star admirals get up and walk out of meetings. Congressmen and senators, because they don't like the results, threaten to shut down a program or kill the agency's funding. And to have DARPA directors stand up and say, no, this is science, this is right, is very powerful. And I will always be incredibly appreciative of that. And so that was the second filter, is are we asking questions that not trying to be controversial, but at least shake up the status quo enough that it gives you pause and will make somebody uncomfortable. And then the third one was diversity. When I look back on these things, I realized that the programs, the more diverse they were in many cases, the more successful they were. And when diverse, I mean not only multidisciplinary, right, combining all sorts of different sciences, but reaching out to universities that had never done work with DARPA before, reaching out, going out to Estonia, and bringing people in, bringing hackers in. I remember, why would you bring hackers into the government? And it was like, well, because they're actually better than we are, and we thought we might learn. There were many answers to these questions. And I think it makes the PM's job much more difficult, but I think the results pay off. I still remember going to MIT with Howie and watching a room full of computer scientists and biologists sit there and us saying that the door is locked until they come up with some common new framework. And I always thought about it because the first day was like the high school dance, you know, all the boys and girls on different sides. And it was one person, and in my heart I wish it was a computer scientist, but it was not. It was a biologist who walked over and did the, hi, I'm a biologist, what exactly do you do? But from that came really interesting programs and interesting ideas. So as I sort of melt all those down, I just came up with sort of two questions that survived this gauntlet. The first is, what if we're completely wrong about cyber? Like literally, what if everything that we're going for is just wrong? We sort of want to have these machines that we can protect and rely on. And what if the hypothesis is that that's never going to be the case? What if every single machine we own is either now compromised or is compromisable? What does that mean for the warfighter? Because, I mean, a lot of our military might is built on this ability to do precision strike, to coordinate attacks, to have tremendous information. And if I cannot know that I can rely on a computer, what does cyber look like in that kind of a future? What would systems look like when I know I can't rely on any particular thing? And it opens up all sorts of interesting questions of sort of larger networking problems, interesting AI problems. So that was the first one. The second one, which I think is related but slightly different, is as our systems get larger and larger and increasingly are driven by AI and ML, which means much of the code will not even be written by humans, and they will be built on models that are so vast that no human being can actually understand them. What am I supposed to do when I query a system and it gives me a response and it's counterintuitive? What am I supposed to do with that? And to make matters more complex, what happens when I ask that exact same system the same exact question and it gives me a different result? And I don't know whether that's because it's compromised and has a bad result or whether it's just because the model has changed and computers move faster than humans, and I just don't know what to do with that. And yet I still have to make potentially life and death decisions over that. How am I going to interact with that? And then the more you peel this onion, the deeper the question gets, because then you realize, well, wait, not only am I dealing with these huge complex computer systems, they're dealing with enormous amounts of data. And we know that through completely unintentionally, you can introduce tremendous bias into any computer system, not knowingly, just by bringing it in. And then if we take that a step further and you think, oh my goodness, well, what if that data has purposely been compromised or tampered with, and now I'm relying on these models? How am I going to live in that world? And I think that is a world that we are hurtling into. And so I think it's a perfect time for DARPA to step up and start to at least ask the questions. And I think in true DARPA fashion, I don't have an answer to any of these things, but I think there are people out there, if the question is precisely framed and the right people are brought in, that we can start to get an answer. So with that, I know that Steve can only hold his breath for 10 minutes, and so I will end with that and turn it over to John. Thanks, man.
It's great to be here. I knew it would be fun to come back to see you all, but I have to say I was not expecting just the jolt of joy I got going through the corridors yesterday and seeing each of you, just this sense of good friends and wanting to be with good friends. I guess it's a testament to how impactful our time at DARPA is and how much the bonds that we form at that time, they affect us. So a beneficent cyber future. I started to think about what would it be like if we fixed a lot of the problems that we have today. Suppose that we don't break all our crypto all the time. Suppose our systems are built with the kind of fuzzing and static analysis that other people have referred to. Brian mentioned some of it in this talk. Maybe even we've done some formal verification, and so the system is correct by construction, and we're pretty sure that it doesn't have a major vulnerability in it. Are we done? Is it the end? So what I'd like to do in my few minutes is just give you an idea of something that I think will endure even in that future and that we'll need to think about. And that idea is called trust engineering. Now, I use the word trust in a very careful way. It's different from the word trustworthy. So I'm talking about systems that are trustworthy, that is, we have reason to trust them, and now the question is, where do we place our trust in a system that is trustworthy? And I'd like to suggest that there's something that's a little bit like a conservation law from physics. It's not quite a conservation law, but it's a little bit like a conservation law. You can't eliminate trust. Sort of like energy. You can't just get rid of energy. You can't eliminate trust. What you can do is move trust around. You can isolate it. You can narrow it down. You can do all sorts of engineering with trust. But you need to think about moving it and engineering it rather than hoping to say, I don't need to trust in this system anymore because it's trustworthy. I don't need to rely on it in some sense. So let me give you an example. You all came out of your hotel rooms, you locked your hotel rooms, and you're confident now that, yeah, I've got a key on my hotel room and it's locked. But the question that you need to ask yourself is, even supposing that the lock is secure, who has access to your key card? Well, only I have access to my key card, so that's great. But who else could generate a key card? Oh yeah, the front desk could generate a new key card for my room. Who has access to the ability to generate a new key card? And so suddenly you're asking yourselves lots of questions as to, now I don't have to just trust that nobody will wander into my room, but I do have to trust as to who gets access to the ability to create entry into my room. And so I give it as a hotel room example, but it happens in crypto. I've got crypto on my system, so it's secure. Yeah, but who has the keys? Who can generate keys? Lots of questions arise like that. So I'd like to talk about two modern ways of thinking about adding trust to a system and do a little bit of trust analysis in what's going on in these systems. So the first is the idea of blockchain. Now, I don't just mean Bitcoin and Ethereum and those kinds of things, but any time that you have a distributed ledger that is spread around lots of people, the idea is if I distribute this ledger around tons of people, then I'll be able to trust it. So here's roughly the way that a ledger works. I might have a sequence of things in my ledger, and I'm just using letters of the alphabet for here. And then I add a piece of information to the end of the ledger. And people around the world sort of add pieces of information. And if it's people around the world adding information, then sometimes different people will add different information onto the end of the ledger. And now the question is, what's the actual ledger supposed to be? And maybe people continue to add on both of these. So one branch had a W and then an S, and the other had a T and then an S. So which of these represents truth? And the key idea in these distributed ledgers is that it's computationally expensive to add things to the ledger. And so it's going to be the case that one of those branches starts to get longer than the other branch. And so when one branch starts to get significantly longer than the other branch, the shorter branches are deprecated, and they're assumed to just be essentially null branches. It's sort of like a tree growing. There's lots of things that come out of it, but you can tell ultimately where the trunk of it is. And so you get this longest ledger, which becomes, in some sense, undeniable fact about what's true. So where does trust reside here? Trust resides in the idea that this is distributed across the world, that there are thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who are doing it, that there's an expensive computation, and so you will get to a stage where one of those paths will be longest. And so based on this, people have put millions of dollars into things like Bitcoin and Ethereum and things like that. So where is trust? Do we no longer have to trust anything about this system, even if we can't hack into the system itself, even if it's all been correct by construction? Where does trust still reside? If we believe in this idea that trust cannot actually be eliminated, we need to ask that question, where does trust reside? So one of the places that trust resides is this idea that it's distributed, that there's no collusion going on between the participants. And one of the challenges with that is that what happens if there is collusion? Yeah, but there's thousands and thousands and thousands. How will you ever get thousands of people to agree? I don't know if any of you are familiar with a thing that happened a couple of years ago, the hard fork that Ethereum did, the DAO fork, it's often called. So there was a situation where there was actually a bug in an Ethereum contract, and people were able to steal money out of the Ethereum contract. And the Ethereum community noticed this and thought, oh, shoot, that wasn't done the way that we thought it was supposed to do. If only we could undo this. But it's distributed. How can you undo it? You know what? Let's all get together and let's vote on being able to undo it. And indeed, they did. They voted on being able to undo it. So the very place where trust is supposed to reside, that you cannot get collusion, they all colluded in order to be able to undo it. And so that raises some interesting questions. To what extent is this actually trustworthy when you can see that there are cases where collusion happens? And in fact, collusion happens on a smaller scale in various of these situations. You can get, for example, just an individual might discover how to add something to a block, and instead of immediately publishing it so that other people can add onto that, they hold it themselves and then work on adding the next thing to the block. If they manage to add 2 things to the block, then what they might do is publish, they'll still hold it. If somebody else at that point gets something in advance, they'll publish the first one, and then the second one, denying the work that the other people have done. So by holding your cards close to your chest, you can actually gain an advantage. And if you collude with somebody else to do that, it increases the advantage. And collude with a few hundred people, and it even more increases the advantage. And so there's some interesting subtleties in the protocol. Even though the protocol in some sense hasn't been broken, you still need to think about the nature of trust. Here's another case. We've done a fair amount of work at DARPA about thinking about not only how do you encrypt data when it's in transit, when you're doing a message, not only do you want to encrypt data when it's at rest, but how do you encrypt data while you're actually computing with it? And part of the reason that you care about encrypting data while you're computing with it is you don't want to have to trust the system administrator on any of those machines who might take a memory dump and look at the data and see what's going on in your data. So I don't want to trust a particular system administrator. So how do I make sure that trust is in some sense not residing in one of those individuals? And so one method, there's a bunch of methods. The most promising computationally at the moment is something called secure multi-party computation, where you have a number of servers, they all have encrypted data on them, and they work their computation in a way where they're communicating constantly with one another, but on any one of those machines, the data is always encrypted, even while the computation is taking place. It's wild technology. It's beautiful stuff. So any one machine has no meaningful information on it. It's essentially random. It's only when you see the collection of this that you realize that there's some actual meaning to the data. Now, there is a trust requirement here, and that trust requirement is that if multiple machines, or the owners of multiple machines, collude, then the information is exposed. So if I think about trust engineering, I have to think about, so that's now where trust resides. What can I do to make sure that that collusion is impossible or is reduced in its likelihood? So one is, I might make sure that the architectures of the machines are different so that nobody can break into multiple machines with the same attack. They have different administrators. They're in different locations. There may be different motivations for the parties. Suppose I use it for doing vote counting in elections. Maybe one of the parties is the Democrat Party, one is the Republican, one server is the Democrat, one is the Republican, and one is some neutral election watchdog. And they all then have motivation not to collude with one another. So then you start thinking about this trust engineering. So in any kind of beneficent future, the key questions to ask about where trust is, any trust scheme that I come up with, are things like, I've moved trust around, where now does trust reside? Who sets or updates a distributed protocol, for example? How can we be confident that this trust is maintained as the system keeps going on? How do you prevent coalitions or other kinds of collusions? Or how do you discover when collusion is taking place? And a great one to ask, particularly these days when everybody is going blockchain, 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 as if it's the magic answer to everything, is the new trust in this system any better than the old trust for this particular purpose? For example, blockchain is essentially just a distributed database. That's all it is. Why do I think it's better in a particular case to have lots of people share the trust versus having a trusted party, maybe a company or a government or something like that, that I might individually trust? So we always need to ask the question, is new trust better than old trust for the desired purpose? So let me just say one final thing to conclude. In a beneficent cyber future, it's really important that we start thinking seriously about trust engineering. And there are times even today when that question is important. Where does trust reside? And how do I think about my confidence that that trust can be maintained? Thanks very much.
Yeah, great, John. Yeah.
So, John, it seems like there wasn't any trust before there were people. But we can't get rid of trust, so it's going to be piling up everywhere now. So where are we going to put it all? So good morning.
Trust no one.
Cyberspace is pervasive and complex. Hackers routinely take advantage of this complexity, whereas the deck is stacked against defenders who must anticipate all possible attacks. Given recent advances in artificial intelligence, it might seem that AI would be a powerful technology to harness for cyber defense. And indeed, many have made this argument, envisioning a future in which superhuman AIs defend enterprise networks at machine speed. Now, that may well be our future, but if so, it's not showing up yet in the numbers. Last year, companies worldwide spent over $89 billion on cybersecurity, and yet they reported thousands of incidents and breaches. Some of these breaches were quite severe, exposing the personal data of millions of people. And some of the incidents had severe real-world consequences. For example, a year ago last spring, the WannaCry ransomware infected 1/3 of all English hospitals, causing some of them to turn patients away because they'd lost control of their computer systems. This is because ransomware is an attack that encrypts your files in order to extort a payment for the decryption key. Before ransomware was invented, encryption was simply part of your defense in depth. You encrypted your files to keep them safe. Now, encryption is ambiguous. If you find a program encrypting your files, it may be part of your defense or it may be working against you. In general, figuring out which programs on a computer are malicious is an extremely difficult decision process to automate. However, we need to get a handle on this problem before we can build a superhuman AI cyberspace defender. The autonomous reasoning systems that competed in the Cyber Grand Challenge did so by searching for inputs to the software they were defending that would cause it to crash. Why crash? Because that's an unambiguous signal of a vulnerability that they could then go find and patch. In the final competition, they demonstrated that scaled-up autonomous systems may well be able to preemptively find and fix some classes of vulnerabilities, which would be a substantial improvement over our current practice of reacting to hacks and breaches with after-the-fact patches. Unfortunately, not all vulnerabilities signal their presence with a crash. So a few years ago, the Heartbleed flaw, which caused enough pain across the internet to get its own logo, was silently leaking information from internet servers without crashing. When triggered, it just executed software that did the wrong thing, such as transmitting encryption keys and login credentials and other sensitive information to attackers. It was only found because a Google security engineer was doing a line-by-line audit of the relevant software. Yep. So perhaps there is a role, after all, for human defenders in cyberspace. 60 years of research in artificial intelligence has not yet produced systems that can apply contextually relevant knowledge to reason as flexibly as humans do. However, AI excels at logical inference, and recent advances in machine learning have produced remarkable pattern recognition capabilities. I'd like to tell you about 3 approaches DARPA is pursuing that combine human and AI reasoning to defend cyberspace. The first, dealing with the semantics of code, the second with engineering trust, and the third with the complexities and risks of system configuration. A cyber reasoning system analyzing a large program is exploring a vast space. However, if it could produce a visualization at the right level, the human visual cortex is extremely powerful. In a recent experiment, undergraduate computer science students provided a cyber reasoning system with hints by studying diagrams it had produced of the code that it was analyzing. With those hints, that system was able to detect 94% of the access control and cryptographic vulnerabilities in that software. And these are vulnerabilities that don't signal their presence with a crash. So DARPA is now researching ways to enable humans to apply their semantic understanding of software to assist cyber reasoning systems, which can enable preemptive finding and fixing of many more types of vulnerabilities than is possible today. Of course, if we can secure software, hackers will shift their focus. So for example, people at work are constantly communicating with others, both inside and outside their organizations. And these organizations depend on a basic level of trust, which hackers can exploit via social engineering. For about the past 5 years, the FBI has been tracking what they call business email compromise attacks, in which hackers first gain access to the accounts of a senior executive, typically the CEO. They then study the organization for weeks, even months, looking at who talks to whom, what are the key issues, and they identify an individual who has the authority to transfer funds. At the appropriate time, they engage with this individual. And it might go something like this. We have an opportunity to buy our largest competitor. However, if word of this leaks out, it could move the markets, create a bidding war, we might lose. So we have to keep this confidential. I'm going to work directly with you. Tell nobody else. Now, I need you to wire some funds to this account. Just like that, hundreds of thousands of dollars are gone. These attacks are crippling and even bankrupting smaller companies. Social engineering is the process of establishing trust between attacker and victim over a series of interactions. DARPA is researching ways to apply AI natural language understanding to detect the onset of such attacks and insert bots into the communications. Bots, after all, are immune to the psychological pressures of social engineering, yet they can carry on a conversation for dozens of turns, often eliciting information that is actually useful in detecting future attacks, while absorbing the energy and efforts of the attacker, and most importantly, giving the targeted human in the loop the time to step back, calmly assess the situation, and determine the nature and severity of the threat. So if we can harden software and prevent social engineering, how will attackers react? Well, unfortunately, our systems today are so complex that they're routinely misconfigured. It's estimated that 70% of all cloud data breaches last year were due to misconfigured servers. Misconfiguration is by far the #1 cause of network outages. A single debugging port left open can enable attackers to bypass an otherwise secure firewall and access the system behind it without actually hacking it. The issue here is that for government and industry, there's simply no cost-effective alternative to commercial off-the-shelf IT equipment. And this equipment is designed to appeal to the needs of the broadest possible customer base, with hundreds of features controlled by technically arcane and cryptically named configuration settings that typically default to provide convenience and a good out-of-the-box experience rather than security. For example, on my home router, among other inscrutable settings, I see UPnP and NAT. Well, it turns out that UPnP is universal plug-and-play, or as it's been called, universal plug-and-pray, due to the numerous vulnerabilities associated with it. So that setting should definitely be off. NAT, however, network address translation, is an essential element of any network's perimeter security. So that should definitely be on. So notice that just these two settings have given me 4 possible configurations of my router, only one of which is secure. I get a 25% chance of getting this right. And that's before we get to the hundreds of settings in an enterprise router. Even worse, configuration is not a set-it-and-forget-it task for any complex system. For example, integrating new hardware into a system frequently requires changes to multiple configuration settings, which may interact in counterintuitive ways to create cyber vulnerabilities. DARPA is researching ways to apply AI to read the documentation of this equipment in order to extract configuration information to construct models at the component and system level. These models can then be used by the human system designers and engineers by applying their semantic understanding of the system software and its cybersecurity context to create secure configuration sets and assess the implications of configuration changes. So in summary, the three approaches I've just outlined combine human and machine reasoning to secure an aspect of cyberspace. Human understanding of context is essential to infer the intent of human adversaries, whereas AI pattern recognition and logical inference is essential to operate at scale. And so we have AI systems that can reason contextually as well as people do. We believe that multiple human-machine approaches will be needed to create a beneficent cyber future. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you, gentlemen. What I thought we'll do here is just since we've started not too many years ago looking at cyber pretty much centralized or focused on software. And that certainly is a big part of cyber. But I think what we see in all of our presentations here is it's expanded beyond that. John ending on the human side, social engineering. John, you're bringing out at a more abstract level that trust can expand into many different areas. Perhaps it'd be nice just to share with us your thoughts of how you see cyber defined today. Welcome your insight on that.
That's a you question.
A me question. Well, for me, I have a really simple idea of cyber, or cybersecurity, which is that the system does its intended behavior, intended as by the authorized owners or users of the system. So I have this really simple notion of it. But I think within that simple notion, there's something much richer. One of the things, actually, Dan, you said years ago, I found incredibly inspirational. It was while you're still...
Really?
Yeah.
There's only one.
It was, you were giving a talk about your vision for cyber. And you said that for ages, you knew that there was this major problem, and you had one question up on the wall of your office, and it was the question, why? Like, why should we at DARPA get into cyber? Yeah. And the trouble is that there's so many things that you can do, like put out this fire, put out that fire, but that's not the DARPA thing. So I think the big thing for DARPA is, like, we know in some sense, or for me, I know what cyber is, but why do we get into it? What is it we think we can do? So I love those big questions about it. But anyway, what do you think cyber is?
No, I think it's right. It's funny. I was thinking about that the other day, but I was even redefining hacking. Like, imagine somebody got onto my computer system and answered all my emails, which would be awesome, and finished all the POs, and then wrote all my personal. Yes. Okay. So that's the thing. So I guess my system's been hacked, but it seems like a beneficial hacking, and so I wonder if you have to redefine that as to what I really needed to do is to start to think about, when is it doing a thing I don't want to do? When all of a sudden it wants to make a large donation to a Nigerian prince, I have an exclusive offer. But he's contacted me,
Yeah.
which is spectacular. But I always wonder whether that may be the future. I wonder if it's less about computers and more about people. Can you figure out things that I would normally do and things that I would do, and then have it somehow intercede and say, this doesn't feel like a thing you would do. And I don't know, but maybe are we potentially less complex than computer systems? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting. It comes, one question from the audience, which really pertains to this, is social engineering continues to be a major problem in cybersecurity and is a challenging attack vector to counter. How is DARPA countering these attacks? And I think, John, you touched quite a bit upon this here.
Yeah, so, well, as I mentioned, social engineering is a situation in which it's actually not in some sense, it's not a cyber problem, it's a psychological problem, because you're facing this pressure, you feel that, oh, well, it's my boss telling me to do something, and these attacks are therefore very effective. And so in this case, what we're looking at is trying to create a certain gap of time in which the human can actually step back and say, now, does this really seem like what Dan would tell me to do? You know, is there some other explanation for why this is happening to me? And so I think that really goes towards some of this notion that everything in cyber happens at machine speed, which is an ill-defined speed. In this case, it's not that everything is happening blindingly fast. It's that people can be manipulated over a period of weeks even to actually damage a company in a very serious way, because you're actually getting the people in the system to do something. And they control the system, so they have access to all the trust in the system.
And I think social engineering has always been part of human society and will always be part of human society. I mean,
Yes.
The advertising industry is social engineering. I mean, that's how Dan makes his money.
It is.
Just trying to put things in front of people that they want to buy, and so social engineering will always happen. The question is, how do you make sure that people don't have like much larger consequences than they realized? If I get my credit card out, I know how much I'm spending, and I'm really confident that I'm spending it at least on something I want in that moment, even if I have buyer's regret tomorrow. But this other is that you get the message from your boss, and you think it's from your boss, and you don't actually have any red flags going off to say this is actually a spoofed message, because email.
But it's funny, it's parallel exactly to the way cybersecurity is, right? Which is, it's always two sides of a coin, right? John called it convenience versus security. Right. It's the same thing. If every time I get a message from my boss, I go, well, I wonder if that's really him, I will get fired. Right. Because mostly when they send it to me and the question is, how do you buy me the time on those things? And I always think things tend to be less, I know it's weird as a software guy, but less binary and more analog. I think it's more of a spectrum. And the question is, if my boss is asking me to do something and it seems a little strange, but it doesn't have a profound impact, I should probably just go execute anyway. Right. But if it's a major decision, like go send these funds, then maybe buy the time. And it'll be interesting.
Authorization on another channel, for example.
Where does the trust lie, if somebody might ask that?
You just train your boss to never send you PDFs.
Yeah.
Well, it is.
Or we should have a way of having safe PDFs.
Yeah.
I think you guys have something like that in mind.
It's a great start. Yes, the program is just, Sir Sergey's out there, and he's excited to hear that. New program called Safe Docs, which is looking at the question of the security of PDF
on
files.
That whole thing, the idea that we should be telling people, if you get a link in email, do not click on it, is ludicrous. I mean, at some level, we have to do it because the system is so broken, but it's an indication that the system is so broken because it's designed to be able to be clicked on. I mean, I remember at DARPA, sometimes we had sort of social testing from security. They'd send out emails to see how many of us clicked on the link. And then we would get a report back from them afterwards, sort of, good job, 98% of you didn't click on the link, but 2% of you, will need to come in for training. If you want more information, click on the following link. And somehow didn't notice the irony of this.
Yes.
Yeah.
By the way, John, it still occurs. But specific programs, John Everett mentioned active social engineering defense, which is this involvement of bots as to serve as intermediaries between the individual and who might be on the other end. We're looking at the spread of information through social media, through social simulation.
Right.
There are efforts, but it is an ongoing challenge. And in fact, it takes us to another question which picks up on trust. That's an important theme today. With all these concerns about human trust in pictures, AI, machines, etc., what additional work is needed to achieve a deeper understanding of the human? Well, great. Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I don't know how to tackle it, but I think the question's spot on, right? And I think, again, it plays to a DARPA strength, which is this is why you need to have these multidisciplinary programs.
Yeah.
Because I think that's exactly right. You know, we may run around and say, you know, as computer scientists and engineers, oh, it's very complex to understand how social engineering works. But my guess is I could find somebody who's been doing psychology for 50 years and goes, you know, honey, we teach this course. There's like 5 basic steps. I don't think there may be some very advanced social engineering things, but I think pretty basic stuff is working. And the question is, what can we learn and how can we inoculate ourselves from that? Yeah. And how do we do it? So, but yeah, yes, DARPA, go do, here, I'll spend all your money, Steve. Go start that one too.
And to Steve's credit, I mean, we are looking at across the agency in DSO with Adam Russell's programs. It is not an easy problem to solve because this is the challenge of how do you quantify, how can you measure progress in true DARPA fashion as we look at how can we assess ourselves.
And again, there's sort of 2 sides to the coin, because on the one hand, we want the machine to have a good model of what the human beings are doing and what they might fail to do and so on. But on the other hand, I actually am not sure that I want Google machines or Facebook or anybody to have a great model of who I am. You know, I'd like a little bit of privacy, you know, kept to myself.
So I'm glad you brought it up, because I think that's exactly the core. We talk a lot about that. You know, obviously I'm not here on behalf of Google, but I think there's a real interest in on-device intelligence versus in the cloud, things that you know will belong to you, because it's exactly right. You know, if I had a perfect model of you, you can imagine all sorts of lovely things. You open up your laptop, and I no longer need authentication. It just opens up. I ask it to do something. It does it. In fact, if it gets smart enough, it should already call up the right paper for the meeting, hook into your telephone conference. You can imagine all of that stuff. But exactly to your point, okay, well, that's great. But then if it then relays a conversation, a private conversation you had to your wife, to your insurance company, and they go, hey, we're going to raise your premium 20% because you're still eating bacon, right? Yeah. That feels like maybe a step slightly too far. And so the question is, I think, how will you be able to do it? But I know personally, my group too, we're spending a lot of time very interested in, because I think people ultimately want those services. They just want to be safe. And so how much can we do on device? I don't know if DARPA is doing that, but please do.
Well, we certainly, I would say, are, and in some respects, you see maybe more an MTO. So what we can do it from a hardware point of view, but certainly what we can do at the edge has actually very important military interest, because you don't want to be dependent on some centralized infrastructure. But I did want to come back to this aspect of understanding the human. It is appearing in some aspects, and John Everett, you touched upon this, and I don't think you mentioned the program exactly with CHESS, which is Computer and Humans Exploring Software Security. What it is, it's a recognition of the complementary powers of humans and machines with regard to finding vulnerabilities. Maybe you want to talk a little more about that, John.
You know, so some vulnerabilities are algorithmically, you can find them with an algorithm in the sense that you can cause a crash, and then you've got something and you can go ahead and fix that. But there are other vulnerabilities that are in the eye of the beholder. And very difficult. So for example, you find a program on your computer that is silently recording all your keystrokes. That's probably a bad idea. But wait, it's the undo feature of Microsoft Word. It's fine, right? So it's the semantics. It's how that information is being used. And that's part of the issue. And so actually one of our programs, Transparent Computing, is trying to figure out how to identify this extremely difficult process of understanding what is a malicious program is a lot easier if you look across the ecosystem of an intranet, of an enclave, let's say, and you see, oh, wait, that program is touching there, and then this program did this, and this program did that. Individually, none of these actions look malicious, but when you put them together, and then you say, oh, that went to a foreign address as well, and it sent about 2 gigabytes of data out there, that's probably malicious in sum total. And so a lot of the issue that we have in cyber is that we're looking at the wrong level. Whenever we're actually down at a problem, we've lost all the information, the context, the surrounding context. And that's one area where people are extremely good, is bringing the surrounding context down to the point where the bits are actually flipping and can figure out that that's a real issue.
Yeah, and there's a real benefit for this symbiosis between people and humans, because the machines are really good down at the level that humans actually screw up again and again. But as you say, the humans have this large-scale picture that the computer.
Well, and they've shown it, right? They've shown, I mean, there are those experiments where we've shown human, okay, not great human chess players with pretty good chess computers, but not great chess computers, beating supercomputer chess programs that no human being can beat. And so these sort of centaurs, they call them, I think it's a very rich area.
Yeah, it's only sitting here that I realized that that's why you guys call the program chess.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. It's more recent.
We went through a lot of other names before we got to chess.
No, it's a perfect name.
But it was an interesting point about the program, though. It inspired Dustin Fraze, who was the program manager, who was at Cyber Grand Challenge, and watched how these, autonomous systems would work. And then in the actual capture the flag competition, one team at least used their cyber reasoning systems and watched how they could really accomplish things that, if it was all humans alone, would just not have the determination, I guess we would call it. Although the machine doesn't have determination, but would not be, intimidated by working hours. Relentless. We saw that at Grand Challenge too, right, with the self-driving vehicles. Another question here is, where does DARPA see formal methods being used, again, to improve trust? Trust being an important theme here. I would add upon that formal methods that maybe go beyond software to include hardware, which we've seen as challenges here. Maybe John.
So I'm not sure I can speak for DARPA, but I can speak for
yourself.
For myself. So formal methods is one of those things that has the opportunity of taking classes of vulnerabilities off the table. And I think that there's a huge potential for places where human beings write code, for being able to generate code. Was it, you put up correct by construction?
Yes.
And so typically formal methods are behind sort of a correct by construction, because what does it mean for it to be correct? So it's using mathematics to really understand the structure of what's going on. And that, even though it's still controversial in computer science in many ways, in some sense it shouldn't be, because in every other field of engineering, it is not controversial to think, I'm going to do a mathematical analysis of my engineering. I mean, imagine doing any other kind of, build a suspension bridge without doing a mathematical analysis of the forces and stresses and strains and harmonics and all of those kinds of things. And the challenge is that it's just taking us a long time to get the tools up to the level that they can be really effective. But all the major companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, those kinds of companies, they all now deploy various levels of formal methods tools on their software base all the time. And they're different for each of their companies. Google has a sort of shallow one that it runs on everything all the time. Facebook has something quite deep that digs down into the, looks for memory vulnerabilities and finds incredible things that the programmers, when they get shown it, think, this is astonishing. And so one of the challenges is, how do we get that kind of expertise that is now present in these large companies and make it available? I don't think that's a DARPA problem, but there's certainly opportunity there for making those kinds of tools available to broad levels of people.
Absolutely. Well, and John, you touched upon.
Another aspect of formal methods is this formalization of classes of languages. So you have, some languages that are Turing complete, for example, and we tend to go for that level because, well, you need more power when you're computing, but the problem is this creates a lot of undecidable issues, and it makes formal methods very difficult to apply. So like 4 years ago, and Jacob Torrey, actually before he became a PM, shows up in my office and he says, I'd like to explore doing sub-Turing languages. So could we actually compute without the full power of a Turing machine? And it turns out that, we can get a lot of computing done, and yet you can prove some guarantees about that. And so that's going to be an element of the SafeDocs program that Sergey Bratis is running.
That's a good point. And maybe you want to elaborate a little more, John, in terms of how by going sub-Turing you can continue to do the desired functions, but then you really reduce the attack surface.
So the issue is that a lot of times when you're trying to prove any large, I guess the nemesis of formal methods is large programs because they explode combinatorically. And so we could, if we had billions of years of time, we could maybe plow through them all. And so you're always getting an approximation
Yeah, the general rule is if it's run for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, then it's never going to. So billions of years
it'll be fine.
help.
Your bridge will stand up. It'll be great.
No, I mean you'll never get the answer.
Well,
if it takes that.
Yeah. But if you've instead framed your problem in terms of a sub-Turing language, you don't have to deal with the halting problem, for example. And so you can see, oh, okay, this is actually going to run, and you get some greater guarantees on certain properties, certain security properties that you can prove.
Yeah. Well, another question here is, we certainly, I know all four of us have been sort of pushing for programs to have open source software. Mm-hmm. Certainly we've been talking about security of software, but how does open source play into all this? Be curious to see your perspectives on that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I obviously, when I was there, I started the open source catalog, so I'm a pretty big believer in it. Yeah. And there was, again, my long litany of upsetting people. That was part of it, but it was a pretty simple premise, which is the American taxpayers paid for the work, and if it's not classified, or obviously there are cases where it shouldn't, go out, but for the most part, we should share this stuff. And I think, as a general rule, the world becomes stronger the more open it is, and the more shared you are. There's more, you have more brain power pulled to it, and you can find more problems in it. I'm not naive. Obviously, by doing that, you're also letting adversaries see it. And I think part of it is how you perceive the world. I tend to be a pretty optimistic person. I think the good does outweigh the bad. And if we can empower the good, even if I understand that I'm empowering the bad a little bit, I think ultimately good will triumph. So I'm a big fan of open software and support a lot of it. In fact, even inside of Google, we release enormous amounts of stuff. In fact, sharing all our AI with people, TensorFlow, you could see a case to hold it. But it becomes much stronger.
Yeah, and I think the lead that you put in the office is something that we've carried on.
We
when I was putting a program together, it was like, the results need to go out open source because you get a huge benefit. The downside is that you might think that if I just publish this open source, then I'm done. But of course, code decays over time. I mean, it's bizarre. There's some other law there that I can't quite. But somehow code decays over time, and things have to get maintained in order to be relevant. And open source isn't a panacea, but getting the stuff out there so that other people can build on it, I think is tremendously
It's an old soapbox, but I'll still say this. It never happened, but I wish people would publish their failures too, because it would save the American economy billions and billions of dollars to do that. Just publish it and just let us know. There is tremendous value in something not working. It's okay.
Right.
That actually is a theme of a program we have, Synergistic Discovery and Design, Jen's program.
Yeah.
Where it is intended to capture failures as well as successes. And I think you're seeing certain aspects, at least in the research community.
Searching in huge data structures.
But yes.
Like, what do I find? What don't I find?
Yeah, exactly.
And this has become a real issue in machine learning, where you have these millions of hyperparameters that get set in mysterious ways, and then that doesn't get recorded, and so it's very hard to replicate these findings. And it's going to be increasingly important, particularly as machine learning practice is running ahead of theory right now.
Well, that's gone by fast.
This was fun.
It was great enjoying the conversation, and I hope all you did as well. Thank you again for participating on our panel.
You go off the
Yeah. You go whichever way you like.
this way.